are going to speak about energy and transport in Africa, which is pretty difficult to do in an hour, but I'm surrounded by people who are quite exceptional, and they're going to help me in this task. Now, my right, you all know Bruno Weymuller, who is in fact a faithful attender of the conference, and he is of the oil sector, and he is a former member of the executive of Total. And also we have Thierry Margerie, and he in fact was until very recently the vice president of Africa for Alstom, and now he's a consultant, and he's another loyal member. And Dominique Lafont, who today is a member of the CCA Council, and he was Bolloré Africa Logistics chief, and so therefore, as you can see, he is in fact very well versed in African transport. And also we have Astria, Fataki, Iris Development, and he's going to talk about voltaic energy in Africa especially. Now, I don't want to go into the problem of energy and transport in Africa. Rather, we would like to talk about how we're going to do this here. First of all, we are going to, if you like, set the scene in terms of energy and the latest developments in Africa. And then I'd like to give the floor to Dominique, who is going to talk about transport, and also Thierry is going to talk about electricity, and Astria about and others about voltaic energy. And then we're going to especially speak concretely. In fact, the spirit of this conference, in fact, has always been that of being positive in Africa, but we know the enormous challenges that we have to, in fact, take up, especially in energy and transport, which are key to the development of Africa. We always have the two faces of the same reality in Africa. If we look at the demographics, the growth of demographics in Africa is an enormous possibility, creates a market, of course. And it, in fact, is growing as faster in the world, but it's a very heavy challenge to create jobs for the new population, especially young Africans who are coming onto the market. And in energy and transport, we have the same sides of the coin, two sides of the coin, if you like. So I'd like to give the floor to the first speaker. Philippe Delleur. Thank you, Philippe. Thank you. I'd like to give you an overview of energy in Africa, because clearly having cheap and sufficient energy is essential for the development of Africa. And there is a resource potential which is enormous, but to mobilize it, to create the production capacities, these face a certain amount of challenges. Now, even if in recent years there has been quite sustained growth, nonetheless, Africa in energy terms is behind. In 2015, it's about 15% of the world population, Africa, but it only consumes 4% of all the energy consumed in the world. And this is a specific characteristic. And another specific characteristic is the heterogeneity of the availability of energy. We have two areas, if you like. Northern Africa and the southern part of Africa represent just 30% of the population and about 80% of energy consumption, however. Modern energy, modern traded energy. And that means that the sub-Saharan Africa, apart from southern Africa, only consumes 20%. Now, of this 20%, usually it's oil products. And this poses a certain number of problems of a logistic nature. We'll go back to this. This situation is very specific because with regard to energy, oil energy mainly. We also have traditional energy, biomass, which represents about 60% of the energy consumption of this particular area. And certainly we will be talking about this in other presentations. But in fact, we have to look at this traditional biomass consumption of energy because, of course, it creates a lot of pollution and smoke. It creates respiratory diseases. It poses also problems of deforestation. A second particular feature of this sub-Saharan area, which also shows, again, indicates the fact that it's lacking behind, and that is that electricity is not very available. In fact, this is the area which is least linked to the grid. 60%, in fact, of the population doesn't have access to electricity. And that means 650 million people we're talking about. And the last feature of this central area of Africa is that there's an energy potential which is significant, but it is, in fact, hasn't been harnessed, especially for renewables, and especially I'm thinking of water energy and also solar energy. Another area, or feature of this sub-Saharan area, is that we have rural areas which are not very highly populated, and they're very far away from urban centers and the coasts. And then we also, another feature, have enormous urban conglomerations. And to be able to respond to the energy problem, therefore, we have to have two very different solutions. Decentralized modality with small plants for the scantily populated areas, and we're going to hear about that just now. And then we have to have large-scale projects for energy products with financing and technology which is cutting edge, and management availability, which will allow for these large-scale projects. Now, to look at the first aspect of the rural areas and the projects that are necessary there, again, we're going to hear more in detail later. We have to look at this issue of biomass, as I said. In other words, we have to find ways of allowing people to cook more effectively. The use of wood and timber has to be more effective than just using firewood. We have to have biodigesters and others. The technology exists, and they're just very slow to, in fact, put in place. With regard to giving the electricity, supplying the electricity grid, we have to find off-grid solutions, completely different to what we are used to in highly populated European areas. We have to find local energy, solar and micro water energy to be able to meet the essential needs of people who want to cook, for air conditioning, and also to be able to charge their cell phones, mobile phones. Now, for the urban areas and these coastal suburban areas, of course, we have to go for the electricity grid. And we have to have large-scale generation plants, electricity plants, because the curse of Africa is that electricity is very, very dear, costly, because we don't have sufficiently large markets. The problem is not so much the difficulty of, in fact, setting up these large plants, but it's to develop the customers, the grids. Grids are very difficult to manage because the customers are not soluble. There's a question of fraud. So the big challenge, in many ways, is the management of the markets. The infrastructure issue is a very important one. in a country, in a particular country, but also across borders. There are several electrical pools today in Northern Africa, in Southern Africa, 3 pools in the central part of Africa, but we still have to develop them fully. With regard to the production, the electricity, especially with hydrocarbon fuels, with coal in Southern Africa and South Africa, and also all products are used for this in Central Africa. The best thing would be to use gas, to use renewables to produce electricity, rather. With regard to the discoveries, one of the key aspects of the last few years is that gas has been discovered offshore of Egypt. This was found close to the Israeli fields, and also gas has been found in the offshore of Kenya and Mozambique. But actually getting this gas out of the offshore area is a real problem, and it's a planning issue. For hydraulic energy, water energy, the potential is enormous in Central Africa. It is not very readily used, however, and with the experience that we've had, for example, in Congo, the Inga project, enormous Inga project, well, and this hasn't been used a lot. Maintenance is a key issue. Ethiopia has succeeded in several projects with dams, but they've had environmental issues and also the displacement of rural population, and also there's a water issue upstream of the Nile. But nonetheless, this has geothermal energy, and ground pump energy is also has great potential. So the problem of governance have been mentioned, therefore, and these pose, in fact, practical issues. Then there are also the issues of contracts and relations with companies. One last thing. It is said that energy is necessary for economic development, but economic development also, on the other way around, to have the development of energy because it supplies the large and sufficient markets. Thank you. Now we're going to go to Dominique Lafont with transport. You have more than 15 years experience, very good experience in Africa, and in fact you have actually put things in place. It's all very well to say what's necessary, but you've actually done the implementation. So what are the success features that are necessary, and what have you experienced?
Oui, merci. Écoutez, effectivement.
Yes. In fact, I took over Bolloré's activity of Bolloré in Africa in the end of the 80s. Bolloré was in about 15 countries at the time. When I left Bolloré a couple of months ago, we were in 60 countries. So in other words, 45 in Africa, plus 15 that I had developed outside. So I think that Africa was very important, and also countries important for Africa, Dubai, China, and so on, all linked up. When I took over Bolloré in Africa at the beginning of the year 2000, the situation was complicated because the group was threatened by a certain number of factors that in fact cast a shadow over its future. There were certain uncertainties with regard to its core business. The Africans, when I went there, said, well, what are you actually going to bring to Africa? And I equated this saying, well, in fact, the first thing to do is to show and to convince Africans what we are taking to Africa. And to do that, we have to invest. And in fact, the World Bank was pushing a great deal with regard to transport, and we have to take up this challenge. In fact, all the major companies were already in Africa, and so we had to develop a new trade, as it were, infrastructure in transport. And we weren't expert, but we had to become a key name very quickly so as not to be thrown out of Africa. So we had our back against the wall, if you like. Now, in our favor, there was the fact that Bolloré at the time was a conglomerate when we had a certain number of strong African teams, only in 15, but we were well connected in those 15 countries. So at the end of the day, 10 years afterwards, we were number one operator in Africa, and we have 15 ports that we operate, 20 dry ports within the continent of Africa, and we were the first operator in terms of the number of ports, the volumes of material handled, and also the logistics and logistic corridors that we managed, and all the other factors which meant that we could set up the logistics outside the port and port activities. So we had to, and we did, create a very powerful logistics center, which was centered around the port, with all the logistic corridors, which in fact opened up the enclaved countries of Africa. And when we take over a port, we know at what point, in fact, and to what extent that particular port has to serve the hinterland. And we know what's happening 3,000 kilometers outside that port. And that's key for the success. And this became our aim, if you like, to open up Africa. That's our main strategy, to open up the countries of Africa. And today, in 15 years, the ports in Africa have considerably improved. When you look at the ports today in Africa, these can, in fact, take ships which are 2 and 3 times more in tonnage than 15 years ago. We have seen multiplication by 5 of the number of ports available, and one of the key words which, in fact, stymie the development of Africa is the fact that very many countries are enclaved and not opened up. Now, today, we know that Africa is at a turning point. I have, in fact, for 15 years, spent 150 days in Africa, and there's not one country in Africa where I haven't been 4 or 5 times. So we all know that Africa is at a turning point. We can say what we like about Africa, but in fact, there's a simple equation for Africa. Will Africa be able to create enough jobs for its youth? And this problem is all problem at all levels, social, political terms, and also with regard to the general stability of the country. And there is an awareness that Africa, in fact, can, in fact, and must, in fact, develop entrepreneurship, and can Africa, in fact, attract FDI and make it sure, be it FDI or be African investment. And this comes to this, takes me to the second part of my presentation, because I meet lots of people outside who like talking about Africa today. It's become very fashionable, whereas in the 1990s, in fact, people looked at us with commiseration when we said we worked in Africa. But now it's very fashionable. But that doesn't mean that people have taken decisions there too. There's a lot of money available to go to Africa, but not many people that do. When you work on projects, you realize that there are constraints, and that, in fact, not enough has been done to securitize the development and harmonious private investment in Africa. Now, just let me, to illustrate this, tell you about my experience and what makes for a success in a private enterprise in Africa. First of all, it's the where you actually are, being out there in the field. As I say, I spend 150 days in Africa, as do my colleagues, and that's important because Africa is a continent where we don't have a lot of information. You've got to go into the field to find this information. And then you have the question, are the criteria good or not? What I can say is that my experience of Côte d'Ivoire has helped me to have a little less favorable an opinion than compared to the global statistics. In fact, I can't say that the Ghanaian governance was extraordinary, but in fact, we have seen that in fact there was after 10 years of difference and development. However, we still haven't seen things moving a great deal. So, in fact, you can't take the information of other people or the global statistics. You've got to go into the field to find out for yourself. You've got to go out, meet people. You've got to create a network. And in that way, you'll be able to really get hold of the right information. When I decide to invest in a certain enterprise or business, I get information at first hand of the managers. That's important. Second important thing is being reactive, proactive. In fact, Bolloré, when it went into the ports and harbors, we had competitors. In fact, we all know them. They're famous companies. We had to, in fact, do a great deal to be admitted to the markets. And this was quite difficult for us to do. But why did we win our challenge, if you like? We went on the spot, and then we saw the opportunities quicker than the competitors. And also, we're a family-run company, and I phone Vincent and I say what the problem is, and we get a quick turnaround, and decisions are taken very quickly. And that is key also to working in Africa, having a quick turnaround and being very proactive. That's another thing which is very important. Another thing is to attract the very good African executives and get them on your side. I, in fact, passed through a generation that was 15 years older than me, and you know that people say you have to be very careful and prudent, and expatriate financier coming in. Well, I decided to go across the Rubicon, as it were, because, in fact, if you don't cross the Rubicon, in fact, I won't be chosen. And if I don't do anything, well, that'll be even worse. So we, if you like, broke the glass barriers 7, 8 years ago, and the return that we got was spectacular, absolutely spectacular, these returns. In fact, it was slower than we hoped, but where we, in fact, got one through, I went from a level from 12 to a level of 18 and 19 in terms of scores when I got the African executives on board, because they were connected and people trusted them. I was able to see that in terms of loyalty as well, and I've seen that in terms of loyalty, they got much more loyalty than expats. So when you say, well, in fact, we can't find Africans, well, the fact is not that you can't find Africans, that you can't, in fact, you don't have a good image as a foreign company, and you can't attract the best Africans. And when you, in fact, get that credibility, you do attract the right Africans. Of course, you've got to have an international team, you've got to have expatriates, but you've got to have, at the end of the day, a team which is mixed, where the Africans, in fact, feel that they can make and really have a long-standing career. in your company, and that's key to the success. It might seem obvious, that statement, but I think that going out onto the field and actually doing these things in the field is something essential. There's still a great deal to be done. And my newcomers, I address my words to the newcomers and also the emerging countries. And in fact, like China, for example, the Chinese came, and they came with a full Chinese team, and they just didn't come with expats. They came with a whole expatriate community and working team, and that cost them a great deal in terms of image. So my words are addressed to them as well. With that, I have concluded. So my very last point is that there is something else which is very important. Africans want to, in fact, do business with men and not with brands. The human factor is fundamental Africa. So you have to get hold of people who love Africa. That's important. And in fact, I have, in fact, competitors, and in fact, they have ticked all the boxes, if you like, rather like when I was at military service. But it's not just a question of ticking all the boxes. You really have to find people who love Africa, and that means loving Africans, and you have to admit and understand that the relations with in Africa might be, in fact, a waste of time. But people are testing you when it takes a long time. In fact, you perhaps do something one day and you have to wait the whole weekend or whatever. But it's in the way that things are done there, and people are testing you. And I think it's worth the effort. So I think I'll draw this to a close. Thank you very much.
Thierry, Margerie aussi, vous avez une longue expérience de l'Afrique. On vient dans le domaine de l'énergie.
You have a long experience in the energy area and also successful experiences, and on the basis of Bruno's presentation, general presentation. So what would be your experience in African countries? To link up with what Bruno was saying, there was a truly disastrous rate of electrification, and 700 million Africans still do not have access to electricity, one should note. And what is promising is that there is now this possibility of ensuring processing transformation of energy in Africa. And in Bangladesh, for instance, the income is well below Angola's income, and yet, for instance, their electrification rate is just 1/4 of that country's. Vietnam, for instance, succeeded in conducting fully fledged electrification as to the average. Now, on the one hand, there is general mobilization that we can see. In the case of Africa, it's not a question of financing. And there are also, Africa is a continent where everybody would like to be present. What is happening also is that there is growth of renewable sources of energy whose price is presently down. And in practical terms, there is the so-called grid parity. In other words, that renewable energy can be or become accessible as compared, for instance, to the fossil energy. Furthermore, it also allows for a much faster implementation of projects. It is much faster than in the case of fossil energy, and at the same time, it also allows for the establishment of logistics, the necessary logistics, and that again can be done much more readily and more easily than in the case of fossil energy generation. Therefore, there is a change in paradigm that is going on, and this is what, in fact, enabled a number of countries such as Ghana, Ethiopia, Kenya, Mauritania, and sub-Saharan countries to make quick progress in the field of electricity generation. And the way we have witnessed it, Alstom for a long time now has been involved in the energy projects for Africa. First of all, in northern Africa, where practically we were present in all cases and in all projects. And also when it comes, for instance, to coal mining and their facilities, or also the nuclear field. Likewise, and in Sub-Sahara, also we play an important role and have an important share. As far as financing is concerned, international funding by international investors, you have for instance, the big water plants in Sudan or in Mozambique, Inga 1 and 2, that were implemented in this way, and that is something that was made possible. Today, we are also confronted and have been confronted with the reluctance of investors as far as electricity is concerned. They did not want to invest anymore in the water and in the water plants. And there is this reluctance also towards coal, as we can see today, and yet it is very important in terms of energy mix. And in looking where the investments come from, well, China on the one hand, and on the other hand also private investors. And the Chinese, in fact, are focusing on the hydroelectricity or electrical energy, because they are not so willing to, for instance, take on risks in the case of coal mining. And we were able to carry out by using the production, means of production in China as well as in Europe. And therefore carry out dam projects in Uganda, in Ghana, and other countries. And right now there are other such projects underway and under construction. And this is, then as far as private investors are concerned, the first such project took place on Ivory Coast with Bujagali in Eastern Africa, and or, for instance, private oil investors into oil industry in Nigeria, for instance, and taken, in fact, the complex context of Nigeria, where this was possible because they came to us and presenting trustworthy partners. And hence the construction of high-capacity plants. Or in other countries still, where there is this private investment because of this parity network that, in fact, then makes possible parity purchase agreements for reasonable, on the basis of reasonable terms.
les financements sont seulement
this investment project and financing, this is international financing exclusively, but with multiple international partners, including local partners.
Now,
what's the state of affairs
les
now?
besoins sont tels, ils sont
Well,
estimés
we
à
know
peu
what
près
the needs are, and they stand at $60 billion per year. And that is one-third concerning electricity, transmission of electricity, one-third, and thirdly, access to population, to local populations, to rural populations, that is. And in the case of energy, that amounts to $10 billion per year. In this context, the share of the private segment is $5 billion.
Comment aller beaucoup plus loin?
Well, we'd like to do more and reach out to reach 60 to 70 billion mark. And that will depend on different terms for the independent power producers level, as well as the private-public partnerships that could be, in fact, still and should still be developed in Africa. And Bolloré, for instance, was indeed successful. However, in the energy sector, this is still not sufficient, and we can wonder what are the reasons for it. And then there is another orientation. There is this necessity for small projects, small-scale projects that would be closer to rural consumers, because, after all, that does represent the majority of the population, and also with a greater focus of rehabilitation of small hydroelectric plants that can be carried out by the private sector, much more than in the case of very big projects. And the small-scale decentralized projects, that, however, does pose a financing problem. And when it comes to rural electrification, we don't really quite know how to fund it. And perhaps the last speaker, in fact, at this roundtable can say something more about it. So that would be, by and large, my reflections on the financing of energy development in the years to come.
Merci beaucoup, Thierry.
Thank you.
Thanks
a lot,
la balle est passée déjà à Astria. On attend beaucoup de votre intervention parce que on nous dit que le renouvelable est possible, que des projets
from you, because you do say that the renewable energy is indeed something that is possible, and that corresponds better to the needs of great-scale projects. So the floor is yours.
Effectivement, la transition est toute faite. Alors, donc, moi, j'ai eu l'occasion de travailler durant les 3 dernières années au développement de projets.
And that is Ms. Fataki. And, well, that concerns projects in Mali, in Chad, as well as other projects, very small-scale projects of non-electrified villages. And these are much more structural projects, of structural nature. And that exists especially in Chad. Indeed, when it comes to financing the renewable energy projects, there is indeed a challenge on the whole continent. And the non-government sector is really quite limited, considerably limited, when it comes to funding, and especially taking up very important challenges. And that is why one should increase the private sector participation and also, in fact, the synergy between the private and the public. And then this whole question of photovoltaics, because a lot has been done in this area, also some solar projects and the like. There is something, a case that I like very much, that is Mali's case. And 2010 to 2014, a host of protocols was signed in that period, and in 2014, however, there was nothing concrete on the basis of the 4 protocols signed, and therefore there was some discouragement present. Then in 2015, Mali signed 2 projects with international partners, and that has, in fact, represented a certain degree of progress. And then there was also 8.5 megawatt capacity plant that was built. And that is a first case in the sub-Saharan Africa, and other remarkable projects are envisaged. And then in Uganda, there was really a very significant contribution from the government. And there was excellent coordination with the funding organizations, financial organization. And that perhaps brings us closer to an answer to the question put earlier concerning the financing of projects in the sub-Saharan Africa. That was, in fact, a main barrier or obstacle. There were 2 results indeed reached in terms of technology, and then there are also international organizations that made available the necessary means for renewable energy projects. Otherwise, it is not easily accessible, and there is also a fund, a question of a fund that was established by the EU, whose purpose was to carry out 500 megawatt construction projects. However, nothing was indeed implemented because the terms and conditions for using these funds were not necessarily adapted to the scale of projects. And also the selection criteria actually are those chosen for large-scale projects, whereas as we can see today, in fact, the scope of projects is smaller, and it's rather a a question of medium-size projects. And therefore, what you need is, in fact, to adapt to the smaller scale projects. Then also using a new type of instruments, the SFI, that is a body of the World Bank that established joint ventures, such as, for instance, those concerning a project in Mali, a project for 33 megawatt plants, and a project amounted to $60 million. And the specificity is to, in fact, suggest subsidies. And there is risk sharing at the level of the project. And the pre-feasibility studies also, in fact, need to be undertaken. And we think that that's something really quite commendable. And then we have projects up to from 30 to 200 million dollar investment, and that is compatible with the projects to be developed right now. In other words, that seems to be an intelligent approach. In other words, risk sharing and coordination of actors or stakeholders. And rural electrification still remains a challenge for our continent, and there there, in fact, are more and more initiatives that are grouped initiatives, regrouping within a same project with about 10 initiatives, and that, in fact, makes such a project more compatible with the demands of the financing organizations. Then the years 2016 and 17 are expected to be particularly productive for, in fact, the development of projects in the sub-Saharan Africa. Several projects that will come to a sufficient maturity then to, in fact, enter the stage of being operational, and that's very important. There is also solar energy, which could be very important for Africa. By way of conclusions, I'd say that all actors, in fact, that are involved in the project development, either in energy or in other areas, in fact, count on the private-public partnerships without, in fact, overlooking the importance of individual stakeholders and, in fact, asking them to be present, to collaborate, and not just be there behind the scenes, so as, in fact, to work together with the project developers. We've also faced an issue because, for instance, there was not enough financing at the level of project development, and once it came to that stage, there was not enough coherence, and that could have been avoided had they participated at an earlier stage. And therefore, better coordination is what is called for, better synchronized, and as it has already been underlined, there is a lot of private funding available for African projects, and what is lacking, in quotes, is banking projects, if we can say so. And with a bit more of a structure, such as the one that, in fact, I created, that could allow for, in fact, a better cooperation between different stakeholders and counting
Nous avons un quart d'heure pour les questions. Pendant que vous réfléchissez à votre première question, je crois que Thierry voulait compléter l'intervention d'Astria sur le dernier point.
Je voulais juste mentionner
I just wanted
deux éléments
to
très favorables au développement de l'électrification rurale.
very favorable elements in the field of rural electrification. On the one hand, the enormous progress in the field of batteries, because as you know, you have these special batteries, solar batteries. For instance, there are examples in Zambia, one such example in Zambia. For instance, the savings that are possible thanks to solar energy by organizing the so-called energy kiosks for instance, the needs of some 500 households where people come, and these are rechargeable batteries where they can recharge their batteries. That's a special point. These are greater capacity batteries. And then also the capacity that you have, for instance, a small network that is uncoupled from the main network, because otherwise, obviously, the transmission costs are really sky high. Mini networks, in other words. where then you can, for instance, manage the quick oscillations and oscillations that may crop up and that are something detrimental. And that's our experience in the southern regions of Africa, for instance, and I'm speaking here about, for instance, plants of several, of some dozens megawatt capacity.
Merci pour cette très intéressante
Thank you for that very interesting set of presentations. Now, today, I'm trying to look at 30 years. We've been talking of energy for many, many years. And I think that the problem today has to do the energy problem in Africa, in fact, can't be solved unless we decide what sort of energy mix we want for the next 30 years in Africa. And if we don't, in fact, Italy, in fact, is going to remain underdeveloped and be chasing after others. We know that with regard to renewables, we have, in fact, developed all the possible resources, but we don't, in fact, go above 20%. I mean, where can we, in fact, go? How can we do with all the problems of greenhouse gases and so on? But I think we can take the cue from what Europe and China is doing. For renewables, we have these, but also we, in fact, then go for others. So I think that it's a parameter that we mustn't forget for Africa as well. There's this mix that Africa needs that has to be decided, and which is not just renewables, and that's different. Morocco has taken this on board, but with regard to electricity consumption, we can only cover 42%. Even if, and then there's a problem also of distribution, the interconnection of the networks and the conveying in a network is very important. So much for energy.
Notre collègue, que je remercie pour sa franchise et pour la clarté
for her clarity and frankness and for his understanding of Africa.
Moi, je pars du fait que l'Afrique doit faire confiance à l'Afrique.
I think that Africa has to trust Africa and be confident in Africa, and I think this is all important today. The South has
son propre développement à l'intérieur du Sud. Il ne va pas empiéter sur
le nord dans le sud. C'est
des zones totalement différentes. Il n'y a pas de chevauchement. Quand le Maroc intervient en Côte d'Ivoire, etc., le Maroc a résolu le problème de la bancarisation, de l'accès au logement économique et social, chose qu'a pas faite la France depuis la colonisation. Il n'a pas su le faire et il n'a pas voulu le faire parce qu'il n'y a pas d'investisseurs privés qui va aller trouver un habitat pour un Ivoirien ou un Sénégalais. Donc, l'Afrique doit faire confiance à l'Afrique et le Sud doit être aussi dans cette équation du développement. Je parlerai plus du co-développement. Je vais conclure que l'emploi des jeunes qu'a soulevé Dominique Lafont, je crois c'est la clé, et la clé, je crois, c'est la co-construction. Il faut former les gens, il faut former chaque fois qu'il y a un investissement derrière, il faut voir la formation des jeunes, il faut voir aussi le taux d'intégration industrielle, donc des investisseurs et des industries, que ce soit l'automobile, l'aéronautique ou autre chose, et des écoles de formation.
or whatever. So this, every time there is an investment, there has to be a technological transfer.
Thierry, rapidement sur le mix, Dominique Lafont, qui a été interrogé directement.
Thierry on this. With regard to energy mix, you're very, very correct. You, in fact, have to have basic energy, be it gas or nuclear or coal or whatever. And talking about coal, there's a certain hypocrisy. In fact, going for coal-fired plants or allowing the Chinese to do it without the standards which perhaps should be demanded. But you have to have this combination. Gas is also possible, and also, in fact, in some countries it's very difficult and very long to get going, and also ensuring constant service is difficult. Well, I think, and I've said that the crucial aspect is youth employment, and you have to develop private investment to be able to do so. And it doesn't matter where the investment comes from. It comes from France, from China, or from Morocco, whatever. I'm for investment, full stop. I've been told about numbers of students who go to higher education, for example, and they are in fact not linked into companies, and that's a great shame. I believe in private enterprise today more than in public governance. I think that private investments will generate a better fallout, and also in terms of training. We do it as a company, other companies do it. There is in fact the need to have people who are skilled that are going to create these training programs, not the other way around. Now, South-South against North-South is not the debate, it's not the issue. And I have seen, in fact, great things happened. I've seen companies succeed, but I've seen other Moroccan companies, for example, and they have a lot of young, very skilled executives. In fact, what we need is somebody who loves Africa, not necessarily who's African. I don't think we should label people, whether they're from Côte d'Ivoire, Morocco, or from France. I've met lots of Nigerians who say, well, we're not in Africa. And I mean, how can they say as Nigerians go to Côte d'Ivoire? I think it's really a question of mindset and mentality. It's a question of the mentality. Africa is a difficult environment which presupposes that one has to have particular qualities to do business there. You have to have a lot of energy, you have to have a lot of enthusiasm to make headway.
Oui, Monsieur Lafont, vous avez raison.
Yes, Mr. Lafont, you're right.
Sur les 5 critères
With
que vous
regard
avez
to the
avancés tout à l'heure,
five criteria you mentioned, I think it's difficult to
le
go
groupe
against
Bolloré
that.
avec qui vous
The
avez travaillé
Bolloré
jusqu'ici,
group with which you
effectivement,
worked up to a short time ago
non
certainly
seulement
did
au niveau
succeed
portuaire,
in
mais le voilà aujourd'hui
its port
embarqué dans
activities,
le
but
ferroviaire.
also it's going into rail
C'est pas grave,
I
mais
left Bolloré
l'institution demeure.
ago.
Vous êtes parti, mais ça continue.
Okay, but the institution remains is the answer. So, in fact, what you've done to open up Africa is very, very correct. In fact, what you say is quite correct. It's not just the ports that you're interested in. You go into the hinterland, and when you say that you have to go onto the field, and in fact, I think that the other companies are as well, but as sometimes you are quite vehement and very convincing as well in the way that you put things across. I mean, we have a panel here, there are 4 people, non-Africans, but people who love Africans, and we have a lady African. So we could have had 5 Africans, so we could have had 4 Africans and 1 expat. But nonetheless, this panel is very well chosen, and I'm very, in fact, happy to listen to you. But with regard to the question of creating youth employment, that is the big challenge, because we're talking about millions and millions of people that are going to get into the job market. And you say only private investment and companies will be able to create these jobs, you say. Well, I accept that only in part, because we have in Morocco, where Nissan, for example, Renault in Tanger, and others in Casablanca have in fact developed their training schools, but of middle-level technical people. It would be very interesting to create a porosity between what the public and the private people do and sectors do. We have engineering schools, in fact, which supply specifically skilled people. We have institutes which, in fact, then develop their master courses. Okay, there is, in fact, a decoupling, and but there are also areas where this is not the case. I think just saying that the hundreds and thousands of people that are seeking jobs as young people will only be supplied by private enterprise, I think is a bit too much. I mean, you've been in the field, you've seen the equation that has to be squared. So I think one has to take things in a slightly more nuanced way. Now, with regard to energy, there are interesting experiments and experiences which have been carried out. Renewables are still important. Wind is less costly than solar. In photovoltaic plants, certainly you can do this on a smaller level, but with regard to photovoltaics, we get to 14%. The Americans in California get to 26%, and some others arrive at 28%. And then we have the question of storage, and also you talked about batteries, but we, in fact, have to think about subsidies. In fact, we don't have hydrocarbons in Morocco. We have nonetheless, however, 95% of electrification. And the president, in fact, of the countries has, in fact, in Côte d'Ivoire, has, in fact, committed himself to electrifying the country. So this is all important in terms of long-term commitment. I agree with what you say, and okay, I will be more nuanced, but you know, I had to deal with a very wide subject in 7 minutes, and being nuanced and is rather difficult. There have been some countries who have decided very strongly with regard to public policies, and the outcome was quite interesting, and Morocco is one of these. Certainly, in Morocco, the overall policy was to go for infrastructure, go for areas which are attractive, which would attract investment, and have areas which are connected up. But there are not many countries in Africa who were as far ahead as they were, and also as convinced as they were in developing greenfield sites. In other words, starting from scratch, a plant or a project which attracted international attraction. For example, I saw this in Morocco. Perhaps South Africa or Egypt have done similar things. But if we look at Morocco, they went much further. And with regard to training, certainly Morocco has been a fairly exceptional country in Africa. Don't know many African countries with so many young people who are so well trained. That's something that's always struck me in Morocco. And therefore, the question of public policy, I mean, I understand what you're saying. I mean, we as private entrepreneurs, we see many sub-Saharan countries where we private enterprises have to go it alone, and there's a void with regard to public policy. So we have to go it alone. And when I started working in the Philippines and China, China, you can say what you like, but it was very much easier to work in these environments, to work where you don't have in transport infrastructure, where you don't have a public policy or very weak public policy. Well, that really is a challenge. It's very difficult to work in these countries, and that's still the case in many of the African countries. Côte d'Ivoire, for example, has been very successful, and the turnaround after the President Adouadawaya came up is in what we saw, which was the turnaround, was structuring the economic public policy, which in fact was something that hadn't been done before. So you have to see from the point of view, see things from the point of view of private entrepreneurs, where we come in and there's very little from a public point of view. It's very, very difficult to actually get one's act together. Things might surprise you, but in fact, that's how things stars. That's how things, in fact, are. And quite frankly, the competitors weren't as on the ball as we are. Perhaps we can have some more questions, but rather succinct questions, and not, if you like, general discourse. So we have 4 questions, and everybody can then give an answer. We have here, over there, and Serge. Now, I have a very short question for Mr. Lafont. In the way that you look at human resources, you say you have to put the accent on African people. Do you mean local Africans, or in fact, have you looked into the African diaspora and plucked people from there? People who are Africans who have gone to other parts of the world. Have you taken your African workforce from that? Now, what do you think about the initiative in Africa of Henri Boller's investments and enterprise? And is it believed? Do people back it? Same question as before with regard to the Bolloré, with regard to electrification. Hello? I'm a journalist in Figaro. My question is, as a journalist, therefore, in the end of November meeting, in 21, 100 billions, in fact, are going to be set aside. Do you expect, in fact, something really exceptional to come out, or do you think, again, it's part of that hypocrisy that was talked of? I'm Suleiman, and I come from Niger, an enclaved country, Central Victory. I followed what was said and the various points of view. Now, I think there's a missing link in the chain here. Have the people in the room have an idea of the surface area of Africa? We talk about China, Europe, the US, and we put them together. But if we took all these countries together, in fact, there would be still a place in Africa. And that, in fact, is the key to the question of distribution. Even if the energy is available, in fact, we have the question of distribution. And research was not talked about. There were many research institutions in Africa 30, 50 years ago. What's happened to them in the meantime? In fact, we are a net consumer of technology, and that is not a sustainable state of affairs. So what is your view? I'd like to ask Astria to answer, then Dominique, and then Bruno. Astria. Very quickly, we've talked about co-development, South-South co-development, and I go along with Mr. Lafont when he says today that Africa cannot, in fact, choose the investment. and be picky. But we have to look at the quality of the investment that is proposed. And I think quality investment is going to enhance the long-term enhancement of human resources and its training, because this is what we have to look at long term, 30 years. We can't go on a day-by-day basis. We see that they are structural things which have to change. And with regard to youth training, the question was asked, should be public or private? In fact, we are talking about millions of jobs to be created. And today, in fact, even developed countries would be hard put to develop this number of jobs. So the public institutions can't do it on its own. So the private institutions have to be part of this. This is still, in fact, lagging behind. But for those who love Africa and who go into the field, these people can't ignore the fact that, in fact, this is how things have to go. The private sector has to participate along with the public sector. There has to be a joint venture, as it were. With regard to the issue of northern initiatives in Africa for the development of initiatives like was mentioned. All initiatives, in fact, have to be welcome. Some are more structured than others. Mr. Bolloré's interventions and plans are very structured. But I think that, in fact, you have to leave people the benefit of the doubt when they come. But, however, you have to judge things on the concrete results. With regard to the Club 21, I think that there's not a lack of investment or funds. The question is how to, in fact, use these and how these funds can become viable, and the extent to which it will be possible to use these funds that are made available. And then with regard to the distribution of electricity and research, in fact, today, in many areas, African countries are net consumers. And when I say African countries, we're talking about sub-Saharan countries. I've just come from Casablanca, and Morocco is certainly not. That's why I said sub-Saharan Africa, and in fact I made a difference between this area of Africa and Morocco, say, because the situations are different. But anyway, certain sub-Saharan African countries are consumers of technology today, but others produce this technology. And it's there where this south-south transmission does make sense, because countries like Chad and Morocco, they have many Moroccan consultants there, and they're doing remarkable work in terms of transmitting skills and technology. Okay, I'd like to ask the question that was directly asked of me. I was recruited within Africa as part of the diaspora, and I recruit the diaspora. And in fact, it does work. There are some countries where this is more difficult, but certainly you can take on Africans who are part of the diaspora, and other Africans from other African nations can certainly work in other countries. One has to, if you like, look at the specifics and history of the neighboring countries. Just rapidly, with regard to the Club 21, in the next few years, the emissions of Africa are going to increase, but we're starting from quite a low level anyway. But nonetheless, this is a transition phase, as we have seen in China. After developing its economy, now it has to turn to the issue of how to reduce pollution. But one virtuous thing that we haven't talked about in Africa is what it has done with regard and what it can do with regard to the buildings and the development of infrastructure and electrification and use cutting-edge technology. Many questions. Well, the Delleur initiative, I think that I have this question that many initiatives, that many investors have. Certainly political policy is all important and the public policy is all important. You're very right. You have to combine transport and electricity in thinking in terms of long distances, because electricity has to, in fact, extend to the last mile, and that's complicated. And I think the Green Fund is an additional fund that certainly can be used for electricity transmission. You know, in technology and research, there are countries who have given very concrete contributions. Morocco has been mentioned quite rightly. In solar energy, Morocco is doing a lot. They have developed a great deal of know-how in renewables, and that can be exported to Africa, to the rest of Africa, and it's starting already. And ENU, for example, has a public company, in fact, is going outside its borders. Thank you. We're running very late, but I don't want to scotch the debate. With regard to youth development, the employment of scientific people is all important. The academy has developed many startups. There are startups that can be set up in many African countries, and their scientists can definitely have a role and a job. I think we could go on for a long time, but I think we have to perhaps draw this to a close. Thank you very much for your attention.